Empire of Blood. Episode 20. Order must be restored. Zuo Zongtang, Qing Dynasty. The smoke came first, not the smoke of cooking fires or harvest festivals or the smouldering incense that curled through the arched doorways of the mosques. This smoke was different. It was black and thick, and it moved low across the ground, the way smoke moves when everything beneath it has been reduced to nothing worth rising above. It was the smoke of homes, of storehouses, of the wooden frames of market stalls that had stood in the same positions for 3 generations, of the things people leave behind when they understand that leaving is the only option remaining to them. The village sat in the Turpan basin, in a depression of land so flat and so dry that from a distance it seemed to shimmer at the edges, as though the desert itself were considering whether it wanted to swallow the settlement whole. It sat below sea level, this valley, which is a strange and disorienting thing to know about a place that is also surrounded by mountains. The heat in summer was, and is, among the most intense recorded anywhere on Earth outside a dedicated research station. And yet people had lived here for 2,000 years, which tells you something about what people will endure when the alternative is the uncertainty of somewhere else. The Uyghur farmers who had lived here had done what people in this part of the world had been doing for centuries. They had coaxed water out of the earth through underground channels called karez, a system of extraordinary engineering ingenuity, onto tunnels dug by hand that tapped the water table deep beneath the desert floor and channeled it to the surface over distances of miles, creating the conditions for an oasis where an oasis had no business existing. Their grandfathers had dug those tunnels. Their great-grandfathers had planned them. The water was communal in a way that nothing else in their world was communal, because the tunnel required the labor of every man in the village to maintain, and if the tunnel died, the village died with it, and this shared dependency created a texture of mutual obligation that was woven into the fabric of daily life with the quiet persistence of water itself. They had grown grapes. They had raised sheep on the margins of the oasis. They had been here long before the dynasty that now claimed to own the land on the strength of a series of military victories that had occurred 100 years earlier, and that, from the perspective of people who thought in generations, might as well have occurred last Tuesday. They had been here long before the officials who processed the paperwork of that claim, long before the general who had issued the orders that were now being carried out with such systematic efficiency that the soldiers did not need to be reminded of their objectives. They already knew. A woman named Mihrinisa was 31 years old when the troops arrived. We know this because of a fragment of oral testimony, she preserved by her descendants and eventually recorded by a historian who spent years gathering the scattered voices of people the official records had never seen fit to name. Mihrinisa remembered that it was early morning. She remembered the light being pale and thin, and that there was dew still on the grape leaves when she first heard the sound of horses. She thought initially that it was a merchant caravan. Caravans came through this part of the world regularly, and a caravan meant trade and news and the particular social electricity that arrived with strangers who had been elsewhere and had things to report. She stepped outside to see. She saw the banners instead. She had 30 minutes, she estimated, from the moment she saw the banners to the moment the first torch was applied to the roof of her neighbor's house. 30 minutes to gather her children, 2 boys and a girl, ages 6, 4, and 11 months. 30 minutes to make decisions that would define the remaining decade of her life, which was not a long time because she would be dead at 42 from illnesses contracted during the years of displacement that followed. 30 minutes to understand that the life she had built, the house her husband had constructed with clay brick and timber, the kitchen garden behind it with its rows of herbs and the small apricot tree that had only just started producing fruit, the small collection of brass cooking implements she had received as a wedding gift, the prayer rug her mother had made, the records of births and marriages and deaths kept by the village imam in a leather-bound book he had owned for 30 years, and that all of this was about to become smoke. Her husband was not there. He had left 2 weeks earlier, gone east to look for work in a city that was still under the control of men who had promised protection to those who came peacefully. He was gone, and the children were hers, and 30 minutes is not very long, and infants cannot walk. She did not know, in those 30 minutes, the name of the man who had ordered this. She did not know that he was hundreds of miles away at a writing table, composing a document in careful classical Chinese. She did not know that his name would be in textbooks in 150 years. She did not know any of that. She knew the banners. She knew the smoke on her neighbor's roof. She knew the weight of her infant daughter and the grip of her 4-year-old's wrist and the sound of her 6-year-old's footsteps behind her. That was what she knew. That was what was real. She ran. She picked up the infant and she grabbed the 4-year-old by the wrist, and she shouted to the 6-year-old to follow, and she ran toward the desert, which is a terrifying thing to run toward, because the desert does not offer shelter. The desert offers only distance, and distance, in this case, was everything. The desert would not protect her, but the desert was not currently on fire. Behind her, the soldiers moved through the village with the organized patience of men who have been given a clear task and sufficient time to complete it. They were not, in the main, cruel men in the way that we use that word in ordinary life. They did not take pleasure, or most of them did not take pleasure, in what they were doing. They were following orders. They had been following orders for years, through campaigns in Gansu and Shanxi and other provinces whose names meant nothing to them when they first enlisted. And they had learned that the way to survive a campaign was to do what you were told, and not to ask whether what you were told was just. Because the question of justice in the context of a military campaign is a luxury available only to people who are not currently in one. The orders had come down through a chain of command that stretched from this village across thousands of miles of territory to a capital city where men in silk robes had drafted documents in careful classical Chinese, documents that used the language of restoration and pacification and the mandate of heaven, documents that described what was happening here in terms so abstract that you could read them without ever encountering the image of a child being dragged from a house, or a mosque being stripped of its contents and burned, or a man being tied and marched east because his labor was required elsewhere, or an old woman dying in a ditch 2 weeks after her village was destroyed because she had nowhere to go and no food to eat. The orders had come from a man named Zuo Zongtang. Remember that name. At the moment Mihrinisa ran into the desert with her children, Zuo Zongtang was not here. He was not watching the smoke rise from the Turpan basin. He was not close enough to smell it. He was hundreds of miles to the west, in his field headquarters, a compound of canvas tents and wooden structures that had been assembled with the same methodical precision that characterized everything he did, seated at a writing table, composing a memorial to the emperor. In that memorial, he reported that the pacification of the eastern districts was proceeding according to plan. He expressed confidence in his officers. He requested additional supplies. He used the word restore 14 times in 6 pages. He did not use the word burn. He did not use the word flee. He did not use the name Mihrinisa, or the names of any of the thousands of people whose lives had been organized into columns of data on his supply lists under the heading Displaced Civilian Population. He was precise and methodical and calm, and the document he produced that day has survived in the imperial archives. And it has been studied by historians, and what it reveals, above all, is a mind that had found a way to think about mass violence in terms so orderly so administrative, so thoroughly routed away from the human faces that populated the reality it described, that the act of writing it required no particular effort at all. This is the story of that mind. This is the story of how a man is made, how a system is built, how millions of people are reduced to logistical problems and administrative challenges, and the phrase displaced civilian population in a document that an emperor will read and approve and file away in an archive where it will sit undisturbed for 150 years until someone decides to open it. We are opening it now. To understand what Zuo Zongtang did, you need to understand what the Qing dynasty was. Not what it claimed to be, what it actually was. The Qing was not Chinese, not in the ethnic sense that the dynasty's official mythology preferred to obscure. It was Manchu. It had been founded in 1644, when Manchu armies swept south across the Great Wall and toppled the Ming, installing themselves as the ruling class over a civilization that was, in terms of sheer population and cultural complexity, the largest and most sophisticated on earth. The Qing emperors were foreigners who had conquered the most densely populated nation in the world, and then spent the next 2 centuries trying to convince everyone, including themselves, that they had always been meant to rule it. They adopted the mechanisms and the rituals and the language of Chinese imperial governance. They became, in their formal presentation, no more Chinese than their predecessors. They patronized Confucian scholarship. They performed the ancestral rites. They wore the robes. They sat on the dragon throne and issued edicts in classical Chinese and allowed themselves to be addressed with the full accumulated weight of 2,000 years of imperial honorifics. And at the same time, they maintained a parallel Manchu identity, a set of ethnic and cultural markers that distinguished them from the Han majority they ruled, a set of exclusive institutions and privileges that ensured the Manchu bannermen remained a distinct military caste standing above the general population. They were, simultaneously, more Chinese than the Ming and more consciously foreign than any dynasty since the Mongols. This double identity was not a contradiction they struggled with, and it was a political resource they exploited with enormous sophistication for generations. They were, in many ways, extraordinarily successful at this project. By the 18th century, under emperors like the Kangxi and Qianlong, the Qing had presided over a period of remarkable expansion and prosperity. They had extended their control far beyond the traditional borders of China proper, pushing west into Central Asia, north into Mongolia and Siberia, south into Tibet. At its height, the Qing Empire encompassed roughly 12 million square kilometers. It was the 3rd largest empire in the history of the world. It contained, depending on which census figures you trust, somewhere between 300 and 400 million people. It was, by most measurable standards, the dominant state on Earth. And then it began to fall apart. The 19th century did not treat the Qing kindly. The problems compounded one on top of the other with the relentless logic of a system that has reached the outer limit of its own capacity to absorb shocks. First, there was the Opium War in 1839, when the British arrived with their ironclad warships and made clear that the dynasty's ability to regulate the terms of trade on its own territory was no longer a given. The Qing lost. The defeat was humiliating in a way that defies easy description in English, because the Chinese concept of national face carries a weight that the English word humiliation can only approximate. They signed the Treaty of Nanking. They ceded Hong Kong. They opened their ports to foreign trade on foreign terms. They paid an indemnity. They watched as the foreign powers carved what they called spheres of influence into the body of the empire, and the phrase is apt because it describes exactly what it sounds like: a process of carving. Then came the Taiping Rebellion. If you have not heard of the Taiping Rebellion, understand that it was, by almost every measure, the deadliest civil war in human history. A man named Hong Xiuquan, who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, raised an army that at its height numbered in the millions and controlled a swath of territory in southern China roughly the size of France, including a capital city, a court, a government, a military command structure, an ideology, and a willingness to prosecute war on the people who opposed him with a ferocity that matched and often exceeded what was done to him in return. The rebellion lasted from 1850 to 1864. Estimates of the death toll range from 20 million to 30 million people. 20 to 30 million. In 14 years. From a single conflict within a single country. Put that number next to anything else you can think of, and it will still dwarf it. The American Civil War, which was happening at roughly the same time and which consumed the full political and emotional attention of a major Western nation, killed approximately 600,000 people. The Taiping killed 50 times that many. It is among the least-known catastrophes in Western history and among the most formative events in Chinese history. The wound beneath the wound, the bleeding that preceded all the other bleeding. This was the context in which Zuo Zongtang came of age as a military officer, and this was the crucible in which his methods were formed. But there was more. While the Taiping raged in the south, the Qing faced rebellions across its entire periphery. There were Muslim uprisings in Yunnan province in the southwest. There were uprisings in Gansu. There were uprisings in Shaanxi. There were uprisings in Xinjiang, which the dynasty called the New Frontier, a name that tells you something about how recently the Qing had decided the place belonged to them, because you do not call a place the New Frontier if your civilization has been there for centuries. Xinjiang is enormous. To say that is almost to undersell it. It is larger than the combined territory of Germany, France, Spain, and the United Kingdom. It sits at the geographical center of Asia, though is surrounded on 3 sides by mountain ranges that are among the highest on earth. The Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun to the south, the Karakoram and Pamirs to the west. Between the mountains lies the Tarim Basin, a vast depression of desert and oasis ringed by the desiccated remnants of rivers that in another geological era flowed year-round and whose vanished waters are now only present in the underground channels that communities like Mihrenisas had spent generations learning to tap. It has been, throughout recorded history, the crossroads through which trade and armies and religions and peoples have moved between East and West. The Silk Road passed through Xinjiang. Buddhism arrived in China through Xinjiang. Islam arrived through Xinjiang. The Persian, the Greek, the Chinese, the Turkic, the Mongol, all of them moved through this place at various points in history. And the people who came to live there full-time were shaped by all of these crossings into something distinctive and complex. The Uyghur people, who are Turkic and Muslim, had been the primary inhabitants of the Tarim Basin and the oasis cities for over 1,000 years. Kashgar, Yarkand, Hotan, Turpan, Kucha. These were not frontier outposts. They were ancient cities with universities, with libraries, with a literary and musical and religious culture that was sophisticated and distinctive and entirely unrelated to the Confucian civilization that the Qing court represented. The Uyghur language had a written literary tradition going back to the 9th century. Kashgar had been a center of Islamic scholarship and trade since the 10th century. The oasis cities had sustained, across centuries of shifting political control, a cultural identity that proved remarkably resilient to conquest because it was rooted not in political structures, which could be destroyed, but in language, music, food, faith, and the daily practice of a shared way of life, which is considerably harder to destroy. The Qing had conquered Xinjiang in the 1750s in a series of campaigns under the Qianlong Emperor that eliminated the last of the Zhongha Mongol people, in what modern scholars now describe as a genocide. Genocide is not a word to use loosely, and historians debate the boundaries of its application here, but the numbers are not disputed. In the campaigns of the 1750s, somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million Zunghas were killed, primarily by the deliberate destruction of food sources and the spreading of disease among refugee populations. The Qianlong Emperor recorded his satisfaction with the results. He wrote poems about it. He had the victory memorialized in a series of official paintings that depicted the campaigns as a triumph of civilization over barbarity, in the aesthetic language of Chinese court painting, which means they are beautiful images of people dying. The land was then repopulated with other groups, including Uyghur settlers moved from the Tarim Basin, who found themselves now living in territory whose previous inhabitants had been eliminated to make room. The Qing held Xinjiang for 100 years. They administered it through a system of military governors and local intermediaries, the Beg system, in which Uyghur local leaders were given official titles and some degree of autonomy in exchange for enforcing Qing tax collection and maintaining order. This arrangement worked, after a fashion, for a century. Then the system cracked. In 1864, while the empire was still bleeding from the Taiping and fighting multiple simultaneous rebellions, the Muslims of Xinjiang rose up. This was not a single unified uprising with a clear command structure and a defined ideology. It was a series of overlapping rebellions driven by grievances that had been accumulating for a century, including brutal taxation, systematic discrimination against Muslim religious practice, forced conscription, the contempt with which Qing officials had administered the territory, and the specific and acute pressures generated by the Qing's own crisis, which was pushing more soldiers and tax collectors into Xinjiang at exactly the moment when the dynasty's capacity to offer anything in return had collapsed. By 1866, the Qing had effectively lost control of most of Xinjiang. The eastern cities fell. The western cities fell. By 1871, only a handful of garrison towns in the far east of the territory remained in Qing hands. Into this vacuum stepped a man named Yaqub Beg. He was an Uzbek military commander from Kokand, a small khanate in what is now Uzbekistan, and he arrived in Kashgar in 1865 with a small retinue and an enormous amount of personal ambition. Over the next several years, through a combination of military skill, political cunning, ruthless elimination of rivals, and the cultivation of a reputation for Islamic piety that helped him consolidate support among the religious establishment, he built a new state across much of western Xinjiang. He called it Yetisha, the land of 7 cities, named for the 7 major oasis centers that formed its core. He received diplomatic recognition from the Ottoman Empire and the British, both of whom had strategic reasons to prefer an independent Muslim state in Central Asia over a reunified and powerful Qing that might challenge their own ambitions in the region. He issued his own currency. He ran his own courts. He maintained an army. He imposed his own version of Islamic law, which in some respects was considerably more restrictive than what the local Uyghur population had practiced before his arrival. and which generated its own resentments and resistances among people who had not risen against the Qing in order to exchange one form of external control for another. But he had, undeniably, state power. And for a decade, it seemed possible that Xinjiang had simply ceased to be part of the Qing Empire forever. In Beijing, this was not a matter of abstract geopolitical calculation. It was existential. The dynasty was already crippled by the Taiping and its aftermath. It had lost face and territory to the Western powers. It had lost effective control of its own tax revenues in significant portions of the country. The whole edifice of imperial authority, built on the premise of the mandate of heaven, the divine sanction that legitimized the emperor's rule over all under heaven, was visibly crumbling. That if Xinjiang was allowed to break away permanently, the logic of that precedent was catastrophic. Tibet would follow, Mongolia would follow, the entire western perimeter of the empire, held together for 100 years by military force and the credible threat of more, would dissolve. And if the perimeter dissolved, the center could not hold. The dynasty that had claimed the mandate of heaven would have demonstrated, plainly and for all to see, that heaven had withdrawn the mandate. There were men in Beijing who argued that Xinjiang was simply too expensive and too remote to recover, that the money required to reconquer it would be better spent building a modern navy to defend the eastern coast against further depredations by the foreign powers, who were, at that very moment, extracting additional concessions and additional territories and additional humiliations from a government that could not stop them. This argument was made by Li Hongjiang, one of the most powerful officials in the empire, a man of considerable intelligence and significant political influence who looked at the map and the treasury and concluded that the arithmetic simply did not work. The distance was too great. The enemy was too entrenched. The cost would be devastating. Better to write off the northwest and defend what remained. Zuo Zongtang argued the opposite. He argued it with the focused intensity of a man who has found the argument he has been looking for, the one that places him at the center of the largest available challenge. He argued that the loss of Xinjiang would be a wound from which the dynasty could not recover, so that the Northwest was not a peripheral curiosity, but the strategic anchor of the entire Western Empire, and that an independent Muslim state there, under the influence of Britain and the Ottomans, would be an open door through which the empire's enemies could operate in perpetuity. He argued that it could be done, that it could be funded, that it could be organized with the precision and scale that he had demonstrated in his campaigns against the Taiping and the Muslim rebels of the Northwest. He argued it in memorials to the emperor. He argued it in private correspondence with allies at court. He argued it with the methodical, accumulating logic of a man who has already decided what he wants to do and is constructing the case for it, with the backward engineering of someone who knows the conclusion before he writes the first sentence. Not in 1875, the emperor gave him what he wanted. The imperial court, after considerable debate, authorized the reconquest of Xinjiang. The budget allocated for the campaign was enormous, partly financed through loans arranged with foreign banks, which is a detail worth pausing on. The Qing dynasty borrowed money from British and other foreign financial institutions to fund the military campaign that would reconquer Xinjiang and install a system of control that persists in its fundamental structure to the present day. The money that built the machine of reconquest came, in part, from the same Western world that the reconquest was partly designed to counter. Zuo Zongtang was appointed Imperial Commissioner for the Pacification of the Northwest. He was given full military authority. He was given the power to draft, to commandeer, to execute, and to make all necessary decisions in the field without seeking prior approval from Beijing. He was, in the formal language of the imperial appointment, acting in the name of the emperor himself. His authority was essentially unlimited within the scope of his assignment. He was 64 years old. He was methodical, precise, and experienced in the organization of large-scale violence. He had spent 30 years developing a philosophy of military conquest that he believed in with the certainty of a man who has never had reason to question whether the civilization he represents is the highest that exists. He began to plan. There is a portrait of Zuo Zongtang that was made late in his life. He sits in formal dress, in the layered robes of a High Qing official, sits with the embroidered rank badge on his chest displaying the crane that marked his position among the civil elite, the peacock feather in his hat indicating imperial favor, the long Mandarin beard cultivated with the same deliberate care he applied to everything in his presentation. His hands are folded in his lap. His expression is composed in the specific way that official portraiture demands, which is to say, it conveys gravity without vulnerability, authority without arrogance, the settled confidence of a man who has already been judged by history and found sufficient. His eyes carry the particular quality of a man who has been photographed or painted while making a conscious decision about what he wants posterity to see. He looks like a man who has made many decisions and expects to make many more, and does not regard any of them as particularly troubling. He was born in 1812 in Hunan province, in a county called Wenjialong, in a family that was literate and educated but not wealthy, the kind of family that produced, in the Qing context, men who are destined for the examination system and who oriented their entire adolescence around the goal of passing it. Hunan is in south-central China, a region of rice paddies and rivers and moderate hills, a place of considerable agricultural richness that also suffered periodic devastating floods and famines. It produced, in the 19th century, a remarkable concentration of the officials and military officers who would define the era. Zheng Guofan, the man who built the Xiang army that eventually crushed the Taiping, was Hunanese. Zuo Zongtang was Hunanese. There is a theory, discussed among historians of the period, that the particular pressures of the Hunanese environment, the density of the population relative to the available land, the intensity of the competition for examination slots, the tradition of Confucian scholarship combined with a pragmatic and sometimes brutal engagement with the physical realities of agricultural life, produced a type of mind that was simultaneously bookish and violent, idealistic about order and entirely unsentimental about how order was achieved and maintained. Whether the theory is correct or not, the type exists, and Zuo Zongtang is its exemplar. He was, in the language of his time and class, a scholar, and he began preparing for the imperial examinations in childhood, as was universal among boys of his background, and he was identified early as having exceptional ability. The examinations tested knowledge of the Confucian classics, facility with classical Chinese prose and poetry, the capacity to produce 8-legged essays of prescribed formal structure on assigned topics, and a kind of moral reasoning that was derived entirely from canonical texts and that valued consistency and elegance above originality. It was a system designed to produce a particular type of mind, one that processed problems through a framework of received wisdom and expressed its conclusions in the authorized language of that wisdom, and it was enormously effective at producing exactly that type. Zuo excelled at it, and he had a memory that retained enormous quantities of material with ease, a facility for classical composition, and the discipline to study for years with the sustained intensity that the system demanded. He passed the local examinations. He passed the provincial examinations, the Juren, in 1832, which was the credential that qualified him for official appointment at a lower level and that placed him in the stratum of the educated elite. But he failed the highest level examination, the Jinshi, 3 times, in 1833, 1835, and 1838. This matters more than it might seem, because the imperial examination system was not simply a credential. It was the marker that separated the men who belonged to the highest tier of the administrative elite from those who remained permanently one step below it. So the Xinjiang was the gateway to the most powerful positions in the empire, the positions that controlled real resources and real policy. Zuo Zongtang never held the Xinjiang. He spent the first half of his career as a man of unquestionable ability who was permanently aware that the formal credential he lacked meant that his position in the hierarchy was, by the standards of his world, incomplete. He was good enough. Everyone who met him knew he was good enough. He knew he was good enough. The examination 3 times had disagreed. The examination was, for reasons that had more to do with the specific tastes of specific examiners and the specific unpredictabilities of a high-pressure one-day test than with any genuine measurement of capacity. Wrong about him. Now, this is a common characteristic among men who become architects of large-scale violence. The combination of genuine capability and felt insufficiency, the sense of having been denied a recognition that is rightfully theirs, that the system has failed to accurately measure their worth, and that the way to correct this measurement is through deeds that cannot be disputed. Deeds are harder to dismiss than an examiner's subjective judgment. Victories are not subject to the whims of a test day. A man who has reconquered a territory the size of Western Europe on behalf of a grateful emperor does not need a Xinjiang to prove his value. He was a reader. His private library, by the accounts of contemporaries who visited his quarters during the various phases of his career, was extensive and eccentric, extending well beyond the canonical texts that formed the core of a scholar official's intellectual formation. He read history voraciously, particularly military history. He read texts on geography and cartography, and had a detailed spatial understanding of Chinese territory that served him well in his later career. He read works on agriculture and irrigation, subjects that most officials of his class and training would have considered beneath their intellectual dignity. He was interested in how things worked. He was interested in the relationship between the physical landscape and the human activity that it shaped and was shaped by. He was, in many ways, the kind of person you would enjoy talking to at a dinner party, if you could forget, or if you did not yet know, that what he was capable of doing with an army and an imperial mandate and a conviction that the civilization he served was both superior and threatened. He married at 22, a woman named Zhou Yizhen from a similarly educated family, and by all available accounts, the marriage was a genuinely warm one, which is not a given in the context of arranged marriages among the Chinese gentry. He wrote to her with an affection that was unusual in the restrained epistolary conventions of his class and time. When she died in 1870, after nearly 50 years of marriage, he was devastated in a way that his letters make clear without his ever quite saying so directly, because he was a man of his era, and saying things directly about emotional pain was not in the vocabulary available to him. He had children. He was a devoted father in the manner that his culture defined such devotion, which meant supporting his household with the earnings of his scholarship and official service, maintaining the relationships and correspondence that were the social fabric of the Confucian world, and writing frequently to his children about the importance of study, of self-discipline, of loyalty, of the obligations that a man of education owed to the society that had formed him. These letters survive. They are, in their way, the letters of a good father, a man concerned with the moral development of his children, a man who believed that the values he was transmitting were genuinely good values. He was not wrong about that in the narrow sense. Self-discipline and loyalty and the love of learning are not bad values. Now, the question is, what framework they operate within, and what they are used to justify when the circumstances demand, and what the framework excludes from its moral accounting. The Taiping Rebellion found him at 40. He had been working as a tutor and a low-level official, accumulating experience and reputation without the formal rank that would have given him real power. He had made himself useful to Luo Bingjiang, the governor of Hunan, as an informal advisor on military matters, and his advice had proven sound enough that his access to the governor's ear was substantial even without official title. When the rebellion began to threaten Hunan directly, Zuo Zongtang did what many men of ability and ambition do when a crisis provides an opportunity that peacetime never would. He attached himself to the military apparatus. He'd offered his expertise and began to climb. He was not initially a soldier in the operational sense. He was a strategist, an advisor, a man who understood logistics and terrain and the organizational requirements of moving large numbers of men across difficult country with adequate supplies and clear objectives. He was brilliant at this. The generals he served under recognized it. He was given more responsibility. He organized supply lines across Hunan's difficult river network. He devised campaign strategies that were later credited with saving Changsha, the provincial capital, from Taiping capture. He developed in those years a reputation for results achieved through preparation rather than improvisation, for campaigns that advanced slowly and securely rather than rapidly and dangerously. Results in this context meant victory, and victory in the campaigns against the Taiping and the subsequent Muslim rebellions in Yunnan and Gansu meant something specific and terrible. It meant not merely the defeat of enemy armies in the field, but the destruction of the populations that had supported them, the elimination of the social and economic base that made sustained resistance possible. This was not a concept that Zuo Zongtang invented. It was embedded in the strategic doctrine that the Qing military had been developing since the conquest of the empire in the 17th century, derived from the experience of a small conquering force trying to maintain control over a vast and numerically overwhelming subject population. The logic was stark and in its own terms coherent. If civilian populations could be shown that rebellion resulted in annihilation, now in that cooperation resulted in survival, the calculus of rebellion would shift. People would choose survival. Order would be restored. The dynasty would endure. This logic is not stupid. In a purely instrumental sense, within its own framework, it functions. The problem is that it requires you to be willing to annihilate people. And that willingness, once established, once the internal barrier has been crossed and the act of ordering mass violence has been committed and survived and rewarded with promotion and honors, becomes a habit of mind. The first time is the barrier. After the first time, the framework has been validated. The machinery exists. The infrastructure of atrocity has been built and staffed and tested and found to work. Repeating it is not a fresh moral decision. It is the application of an established procedure. Zuo Zongtang crossed that barrier during the campaigns of the 1860s, and once he had crossed it, he never looked back at the crossing. He was appointed to command his own forces in 1862, after years of service that had made him indispensable without making him prominent, and he built the Chu army from the ground up, applying the organizational principles that he had been developing since the beginning of the Taiping crisis. He recruited from Hunan, specifically from rural areas, because he believed that rural recruits were harder and more disciplined than urban ones, and less susceptible to the particular forms of moral dissolution that afflicted soldiers in cities. He paid them well enough that desertion was uncommon. He trained them with a rigor that contemporaries noted was unusual by the standards of Qing armies, which were but by the mid-19th century, in an advanced state of institutional decay. He did something unusual for a Chinese commander of his era. He hired Western military officers, including officers from the British and French armies, to train his troops in modern infantry tactics and the use of modern firearms. He was pragmatic about Western capability in a way that many of his contemporaries were not. He admired Western military technology without admiring, or particularly caring about, the civilization that had produced it. This is a distinction worth holding on to, because it tells you something about how he processed information. He was not ideologically rigid. He could absorb useful things from sources that his Confucian formation might have directed him to disdain. He could learn from enemies. But he absorbed these lessons entirely in the service of an imperial project whose fundamental assumptions he never questioned, never examined, never considered from the perspective of the people that project was being imposed upon. The campaigns of the late 1860s and early 1870s provided the laboratory in which his mature military philosophy developed. Against the Nian rebels in the north, against the Muslim rebels of Gansu and Shanxi, he refined and perfected the operational approach that would define his Xinjiang campaign. He advanced slowly, establishing supply depots before moving forward, building or repairing roads, ensuring that his army was always provisioned. He famously had trees planted along his lines of march to provide shade for soldiers on future campaigns, and had vegetables grown near his camps to supplement his soldiers' diet. These details have become legend, used by subsequent admirers to paint him as a humane and practically minded commander, and that reading is not entirely wrong. He did care about his soldiers, their health, their discipline, their morale. But the picture of the general who planted trees and grew vegetables is incomplete unless you also hold, simultaneously, the picture of what happened to the populations through whose territories he marched. The campaigns in Gansu resulted in the deaths of enormous numbers of people, from a combination of direct military violence, destruction of food supplies, and the famine and disease that followed the campaigns through the devastated landscape. Estimates range widely, because the records are fragmentary and the imperial government had reasons to minimize the numbers, but the available evidence suggests that the Muslim population of Gansu and Shanxi was reduced by somewhere between half and two-thirds in the years of Zuo Zongtang's campaigns there. Villages that had been inhabited for generations were empty. Cities were ruins. The physical landscape of the region bore marks of the campaigns for decades. He was promoted after these campaigns to the highest levels of the imperial bureaucracy. He was not promoted despite the scale of destruction his campaigns had caused. He was promoted because of the scale of the results his campaigns had achieved. The destruction was not a side effect that the dynasty regretted. It was the mechanism through which the result was produced. The dynasty understood this and rewarded it accordingly. By the time the question of Xinjiang reached the imperial court, Zuo Zongtang had been building to this moment for 30 years. He was old. His health was compromised. He suffered from chronic lung ailments that would eventually kill him, and he traveled in a sedan chair during the later campaigns because riding a horse was too painful. He was a man who knew, with the specific clarity of the aging and the ill, that the time available to him was limited, and that the legacy he built in the time remaining was what history would remember. Xinjiang was the grandest available stage. He wanted it. He argued for it. He got it. There is a question that follows a man like Zuo Zongtang everywhere he goes. That a question that his admirers tend to sidestep and his critics tend to answer too quickly. Did he know what he was doing? Not in the strategic sense, which is clear enough. Did he know, in the moral sense, that he was organizing mass violence against civilian populations? Did he know and not care? Did he know and believe it was justified? Did he find some way to genuinely not know? The answer, based on the available evidence, is that he knew, in the sense that any intelligent and attentive man who had spent 30 years in military command could not have been ignorant of the consequences of his orders. He had seen the aftermath of his campaigns. He had received reports. He was not naive, but he had developed, through the accumulated practices of his career and the ideological framework of his formation, a set of cognitive filters that organized moral significance around certain categories of people and not around others. His soldiers mattered to him. His officers mattered to him. The emperor he served mattered to him. His children mattered to him. The abstract population of the dynasty mattered to him in the sense that their welfare was the stated justification for everything he did. The people of Xinjiang did not matter to him, not in the way that would have made their suffering morally legible to him as a cost that required acknowledgement. They were variables in a strategic calculation. They were the problem that needed to be solved. They were in the conceptual architecture that his Confucian formation had built in him over 60 years. Fundamentally other, in a way that placed them outside the community of moral consideration, that structured his sense of obligation and his sense of guilt. This is the central psychological fact about him. Not malice, not sadism. Erasure. The practiced, institutional, ideologically sanctioned erasure of a human category from the moral accounting that he applied to the rest of the world. This is harder to confront than malice, because malice is recognizable as evil, and we know how to respond to it. What Zuo Zongtang did is different. It is the kind of thing that ordinary people do, in ordinary bureaucratic contexts, every day, at a scale that is usually small enough not to matter catastrophically. He did it at the scale of an empire, with the tools of a general and the authority of an imperial commissioner. And the result was the transformation of an entire civilization's demographic and cultural landscape. He did not tremble. He did not hesitate. He drafted his memorials with clarity and precision, and the clarity and precision are the most terrifying thing about them. To understand the quality of the erasure, it helps to look at the specific language he used in his memorials. The documents are available in translation, and they reward reading not for what they say, but for what they do not say, for the systematic avoidance of the categories of description that would make the human reality of the campaigns legible to anyone reading them. He writes of rebels and pacification and restoration of order. He writes of displaced populations as a logistical category, a variable in calculations about provisioning and resettlement, and not as a description of human suffering requiring acknowledgement. He writes of cleared areas the way an engineer might write of a site prepared for construction, without reference to what was on the site before the clearing began. He was, in his documentary habits, a master of the passive voice, the construction that describes action without naming an agent. Areas were not burned by his soldiers. They were cleared. Villages were not destroyed by orders he issued. They were eliminated as rebel strongholds. The grammar of the memorials performs, sentence by sentence, the same moral operation that the campaigns performed in the field. The removal of human agency and human consequence from the record of what happened. There is a historian writing in the mid-20th century who described Zuo Zongtang as a man of complete integrity, and meant it as a compliment. He was right that Zuo was consistent, which is one meaning of integrity. He was right that Zuo did not lie for personal gain, did not take bribes in the manner of many of his contemporaries, did not use his position to enrich himself at the dynasty's expense. He believed in the system he served with what appeared to be genuine conviction, Not the performed loyalty of a man calculating his next position, but the deep, unreflective loyalty of a man who has never seriously entertained the possibility that the system might be wrong. This kind of integrity is its own form of danger, because it removes the check that self-interest can sometimes provide. A corrupt official might spare a village because someone in it has paid him enough. Yet a man of genuine conviction spares no one who does not fit his categories of the deserving. The argument for the Xinjiang campaign that Zuo made to the emperor in 1874 and 1875 is one of the most consequential documents in Chinese imperial history, not because it is uniquely brilliant, but because it worked. He had to overcome the opposition of Li Hongzhang, who was the dominant figure in the imperial court's thinking about military priorities and who had the weight of financial reality on his side. The empire was broke. The campaigns of the Taiping era had consumed enormous resources and left the treasury in a condition that made large new military expenditures genuinely alarming to anyone who understood the numbers. Li argued, rationally, that the money required to reconquer Xinjiang was money that could not be spent on the naval modernization that the eastern coast desperately needed. Zuo's counter-argument was strategic rather than financial. He argued that territory, once lost, created precedents that were more expensive than the cost of recovery. He argued that Yaqub Beg's state, backed by British and Ottoman recognition, was not merely a local rebellion, but an externally supported proto-state whose consolidation would permanently compromise China's Western security. He argued that the army he had in place in the northwest, already paid and provisioned, could accomplish the reconquest for a marginal additional cost that would be offset by the revenues of a restored Xinjiang once the territory was pacified. And he argued that the historical and cultural meaning of abandoning Chinese territory to foreign-backed separatists was a damage to the dynasty's legitimacy that could not be repaired by any number of warships. He won the argument, and having won it, he had staked his reputation and the dynasty's resources in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people on his ability to deliver what he had promised. This created a pressure that ran through every level of the campaign, from Zuo's own need to vindicate his argument against Li Hongzhang, to the field commander's need to show results, to the soldier's need to survive in a hostile environment. The pressure to produce victory was enormous and continuous, and pressure of this kind in military contexts reliably produces violence in excess of tactical necessity, because speed and decisiveness are the metrics being measured, and restraint slows things down. Zuo knew this. He had commanded enough campaigns to know that the pressure he was creating at the top of the command structure would translate through each layer of transmission into a pressure at the bottom that his proclamations about protecting cooperative populations could not fully counteract. He knew this, and he built the campaign anyway, because the alternative in his framework was not an option. The campaign had to succeed. The success justified the methods. The methods were not for him to dwell on. The methods were for his officers to manage as best they could. This is the final thing to say about the man before we talk about the machine he built. That he was not a monster in the dramatic sense that the word implies, someone visibly outside the range of normal human experience, someone whose evil is so pronounced and so particular that it explains itself. He was a man of his time and his class and his civilization, shaped by institutions and assumptions that he did not create and that he never seriously examined. He was ambitious and capable and loyal and genuinely caring toward the people within his circle of moral consideration. And he was catastrophically indifferent to the people outside that circle, the people on the other side of the map. The people whose names he did not know and did not need to know, the people who, in the great ledger of his moral accounting, did not appear as entries at all. Let us talk about how it actually worked. Because this is the part that gets lost in the large-scale historical narrative, in the discussion of empires and rebellions and geopolitical calculations. The part that gets lost is the machinery, the specific, granular, organizational reality of how a decision made by one man at a writing table becomes a burned village, how the distance between the decision and the consequence is covered, how the chain of command at each link simplifies and compresses and abstracts the reality until, by the time it reaches the soldier with the torch, it is just an order. Understanding the machine is the only way to understand how mass violence is actually possible, because mass violence is not, in the first instance, an emotional event. It is a logistical one. It requires organization, it requires supply chains, it requires communication networks, it requires record-keeping. It requires, above all, a set of institutional frameworks that allow large numbers of ordinary people to participate in extraordinary acts, without ever confronting the full moral weight of what they are doing. The machine is what makes it possible, and the man who designs the machine is the most important person in the whole enterprise, because everyone else is simply operating within the machine that he built. Zuo Zongtang understood this better than almost any other commander of his era. The campaign he designed for Xinjiang was 3 years in the planning before the first troops moved west in significant force. He began in 1875 with logistics, because logistics was always where he began, and because the logistical challenges of operating an army in the far northwest were genuinely formidable. The distances involved were staggering. From the eastern edge of Xinjiang to Kashgar in the west is roughly 2,000 kilometers. The terrain between them is some of the most difficult on Earth. Desert, mountain passes, river crossings, sustained stretches of land that offered nothing to foraging troops in terms of food or water or shelter. An army that moved through this landscape without an adequate supply chain would starve and disintegrate before it came within fighting distance of its objectives. This had happened to previous forces in this region. Zuo knew the history. He organized the transport of grain and military stores from the provinces of Shanxi and Gansu, establishing a chain of supply depots at intervals along the intended line of advance, is each depot capable of supplying the army for a defined period before the next depot was provisioned and ready. He negotiated with merchants, both Chinese and Central Asian, for the supply of fodder for draft animals. He arranged for the manufacture of military equipment at facilities in the eastern provinces and its transport west on a schedule timed to the operational needs of the campaign. He addressed the question of soldiers' pay, which in Qing military history was a chronic source of desertion and mutiny, by arranging advance financing through a combination of provincial tax revenues and the foreign loans that had been part of the political deal authorizing the campaign. He organized his army into 3 main columns, each responsible for a different section of the advance. The northern column would advance along the Tian Shan route, securing the string of oasis towns along the northern edge of the Tarim Basin. The southern column would advance along the southern route, through the oases of the Tarim's southern rim. The 2 columns would converge on the western cities, Kashgar and its satellites, from north and south simultaneously, leaving Yaqub Beg no angle of retreat. It was a strategically sound plan. It had been designed by a man who had studied the terrain on maps and through intelligence reports, with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and who was determined not to repeat the mistakes of previous commanders who had advanced too quickly, on insufficient supply, into territory that then consumed them. He assigned experienced officers to each column, the men who had served under him in the northwestern campaigns and understood his operational doctrine. That doctrine could be summarized as follows: advance methodically and secure your rear before moving forward, offer the possibility of submission to populations who had not actively resisted. Show no mercy to populations who had. This was not a secret doctrine. It was explicit in his communications, stated clearly in his orders to his officers and in his proclamations to the local population. He believed in clarity about consequences. Ambiguity about what would happen to communities that resisted, he reasoned, would produce more resistance than clarity. If people knew with certainty what was coming if they chose resistance, a sufficient number would choose compliance. The violence was, in this framework, a deterrent as much as a punishment. Its purpose was not destruction for its own sake, but the establishment of a calculus in which cooperation was the rational choice. The offer of submission was not merely rhetorical. Zuo Zongtang genuinely believed that the proper outcome for the people of Xinjiang was integration into the Qing imperial order, not their elimination. He was not, in his own self-conception, trying to destroy the Uyghur people. He was trying to bring them to order. The distinction, from his perspective, was real and morally significant. He issued proclamations in advance of his campaigns in Chinese and in Uyghur translation, explaining that those who submitted and cooperated would be protected and would have their property rights respected. He made examples, in the early phases of the campaign, of soldiers who looted or committed unauthorized violence against cooperative civilians. He wrote to his officers, reminding them that the long-term success of the reconquest depended on building a functional administrative relationship with the local population, and that unnecessary violence against cooperating communities undermined that relationship. The problem with this framework is visible in the phrase cooperative civilians. Cooperation, in the context of a military reconquest by a force with overwhelming firepower, is not a free choice in any meaningful sense. It is a choice made under the implicit or explicit threat of what happens to those who do not cooperate. And the definition of cooperation, in practice, was defined entirely by the Qing military, which meant that communities that had any historical association with the rebellion, any record of having provided support to Yaqub Beg's forces, any member who had participated in the uprising, were not considered cooperative regardless of their current posture. The past determined the assessment. And in a region that had been in open rebellion for a decade, the past implicated nearly everyone. He advanced east to west, which was strategically rational for multiple reasons. The eastern districts of Xinjiang were less heavily defended than the western cities where Yaqub Beg's core power was concentrated. Securing the east first would allow Zuo to establish a firm logistical and administrative base before moving against the more formidable western positions. And the eastern advance, proceeding through areas that had more recent and direct contact with the Qing administrative apparatus, offered the possibility of incorporating local elites who are willing to collaborate in exchange for restored status and property rights. The campaigns of 1876 in the Hami and Turpan regions were among the most destructive of the entire reconquest. Hami fell relatively quickly, its ruling family having decided that collaboration with Qing authority was preferable to the alternative. Turpan was different. Turpan had been a center of the Uyghur uprising and was associated in the intelligence available to Zuo's commanders with sustained and committed resistance. The forces defending the region were led by a commander named Bai Yanhu, who had been fighting the Qing for more than a decade and who understood, with the clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose, that submission meant death. He fought. He lost. He fled west with what remained of his forces, and the troops of Zuo's eastern column entered the Turpan Basin to find a landscape that the combination of years of rebellion, siege, and now the final military campaign had transformed into something that contemporaries described, in the few accounts that survive, as a wasteland. The specific records of what happened in Turpan in the summer and autumn of 1876 are fragmentary, as the records of atrocities always are, because the people who do them are not, in general, interested in detailed documentation, and the people who experience them are frequently too busy surviving or too dead to produce records. The Qing military records describe the campaigns in terms of strategic objectives achieved, rebels neutralized, territory secured. The human cost, where it appears at all, is expressed in aggregate numbers of killed combatants, a category that, in Qing military reporting, as in military reporting across history, tends to expand to absorb a significant number of people who were not carrying weapons at the moment they died. What we know from other sources, from the accounts of merchants and travelers who passed through the region in subsequent years, from the reports of Western missionaries who were operating in the broader region and whose correspondence survives in European archives, from the fragments of local testimony that have been collected by historians willing to work in the oral record, was that the population of the Turpan Basin was dramatically reduced. Villages that had been inhabited for centuries were empty or ruined. The karez systems that had sustained the oasis agriculture were destroyed or fell into disrepair for lack of the population needed to maintain them. The transformation of this landscape from a functioning agricultural society into a depopulated ruin took months. The recovery took decades. In some areas, the specific form of social organization that had made the oasis agriculture possible never fully returned, because the particular combination of communal knowledge and communal labor that the karez required had been broken along with the communities that carried it. Below Zuo in the command structure were his generals, among them Liu Jintang, Bes, who commanded the main western column that would eventually take Kashgar and Yarkand. Liu was a career military officer who had grown up professionally in the crucible of the Northwestern Wars and who shared his commander's conviction that results were what mattered and that the means of achieving results were a secondary question. He was, in specific episodes of the Western campaigns, considerably more violent than Zuo's explicit orders required. This is the nature of command at a distance. The general sets the framework, but the field commanders make the tactical decisions, and the tactical decisions of a man under operational pressure in hostile territory tend, in the absence of strong, countervailing pressure, to resolve toward violence rather than restraint. Restraint requires more effort. Restraint requires more time. And time, once in a military campaign, costs resources. Below Liu were the regimental and battalion commanders, and below them the company officers and non-commissioned officers, and below them the soldiers. Most of them Han Chinese from Hunan and Shanxi, men who had been fighting one version or another of the dynasty's wars for years, for whom the people of Xinjiang were alien in religion, language, dress, culture, and appearance, and for whom the abstract injunctions about the protection of cooperative civilians competed with the immediate reality of operating in hostile territory far from home. In an environment where anyone could be an enemy and the consequences of misjudgment were personal and lethal, the tendency was to resolve ambiguity in the direction of security rather than restraint. The machine worked like this. At the top, Zuo drafts a memorial and receives imperial authorization. He issues a campaign plan with operational phases and supply allocations. He sets the strategic objectives and defines with the clarity of a man who has done this before the terms of submission and the consequences of resistance. At the middle level, his generals translate the strategic objectives into operational orders. Secure the Hami corridor by a given date. Advance on Turpan with specified forces. Issue proclamations offering terms of submission. Prepare for siege operations if the terms are refused. Report progress to headquarters at specified intervals. At the execution level, the regimental commanders take the operational orders and turn them into action. Their soldiers advance. They encounter a village. The village has been associated with resistance. The commander has a decision to make. Offer terms, wait for a response, assess the response, and if the response is resistance or flight rather than submission, take the village by force. Taking the village by force means eliminating its military capacity, which in practice means eliminating the people who might constitute or support that capacity, which in a village context means a great many people who are not soldiers by any meaningful definition. And somewhere in that chain, the human being becomes a military variable. The village becomes a threat assessment. The woman running into the desert becomes a data point labeled displaced civilian population. The child becomes a collateral casualty. The imam's 30-year-old record book becomes combustible material in a structure being eliminated. There were people who objected. This needs to be said plainly, because it complicates the picture, and because the complications are true. Some of Zuo's own officers submitted reports expressing concern about the scope of civilian casualties in specific campaigns. Some of these reports were acknowledged and resulted in specific orders for greater restraint. Some were not acknowledged at all. Some were acknowledged and ignored in practice, because the operational pressure to achieve objectives was stronger than the pressure to achieve them with minimal civilian impact. One officer, whose name appears in surviving correspondence as a man of some moral seriousness, wrote to Zuo Zongtang directly about the scale of civilian deaths in a specific district, it expressing concern that the destruction exceeded what was militarily necessary and was creating conditions of famine among the surviving population that would undermine the long-term administrative goal of a pacified and productive territory. Zuo's reply was civil. It acknowledged the concern in general terms while making clear that the officer's primary responsibility was the achievement of his military objectives, and that administrative consequences would be addressed once the military phase was complete. The letter is a small window into the mechanism of institutional normalization. The concern is heard, is acknowledged as real, is assigned to a different category of responsibility, and is thereby neutralized without being resolved. The officer continued his campaign. The civilians continued to die. So there were Qing civilian officials who, after the military phase was complete and the administrative phase began, wrote memorials expressing concern about the scale of depopulation and its implications for the territory's economic viability. These memorials reveal something significant. The destruction was visible and legible even to officials operating within the same imperial framework that had produced it. The memorials did not question the reconquest. They questioned the extent of the destruction in the narrow register of administrative efficiency. The territory had been so thoroughly depopulated that it could not generate sufficient tax revenue to sustain its own administration. That was the language available to them, not the language of moral wrong, the language of balance sheets. And even in the language of balance sheets, and the message was clear, what had been done here was excessive. It had destroyed the productive base along with the resistance. These memorials were largely absorbed into the bureaucratic apparatus without generating significant policy changes. Let us stay with the machine itself a moment longer, because the machine is not finished when the fighting stops. It has a second phase, and in some ways it is the more consequential one. The second phase is administration. Once the military campaign has cleared the field, administration determines what the clearing produces, and Zuo Zongtang, who had thought as carefully about administration as about logistics, had been planning this phase as long as he had been planning the military one. He wrote, in a memorial prepared before the campaign began, that the reconquest of Xinjiang would mean nothing without a permanent administrative transformation of the territory. a transformation that would make the reversion to rebellion structurally impossible by changing the demographic and economic composition of the region. In other words, winning the military campaign was not the point. The point was making winning the military campaign unnecessary ever again. What this meant in practice was Han settlement. He was explicit about this. He argued that a territory held by military force alone, without a settled Han population that had economic interests in the maintenance of order, would be perpetually vulnerable to the recurrence of the conditions that had produced the rebellion. The solution was not to transform the Uyghur population in place, which he considered a slow and uncertain process, but to surround it with a population that had different interests and different loyalties, until the demographic balance of the territory had shifted far enough that local rebellion was no longer strategically viable. The organization of Han settlement in Xinjiang began almost immediately after the military phase ended. Military agricultural colonies were established along the main routes of advance, staffed initially by soldiers, encouraged or required to remain after their service ended and take up farming on land that the campaigns had emptied. These colonies were provisioned by the state in their first years, given land, seed, tools, and the implicit protection of the military installations they were attached to. So the idea was to create self-sustaining communities that would anchor Han presence in strategically important locations before civilian migration filled in the spaces around them. The economic logic of the settlement policy was, within its own terms, not irrational. Xinjiang's agricultural potential was significant. The karez system, once repaired, could support a much larger population than was present in the aftermath of the campaigns. From the perspective of the Qing administration, the settlement policy was simply good governance, putting underutilized productive capacity to work while stabilizing the security situation. From the perspective of the Uyghur population that remained, it was something else entirely. It was the arrival of people who spoke a different language, practiced a different religion, operated within different economic networks, and who had behind them the full weight of the imperial state. The Uyghur farmers who returned to their villages after the campaigns ended returned to find their land allocated, in some cases, to new settlers, their water rights renegotiated under new administrative frameworks. Their position in the local economy fundamentally changed. They were no longer the primary population of their own homeland. They were a managed minority in a territory being deliberately transformed around them, like people who come home to find that, while they were away, someone has rearranged all the furniture and changed the locks. The most significant political event of the campaign was the death of Yaqub Beg in May 1877, under circumstances that remain disputed. To his death came at the moment when his military capacity to resist was already broken, when his cities were facing siege, when his army had been fractured by internal dissension, when the outcome was no longer in doubt. He died in Korla, in the middle of the territory he had ruled, and with him died the last organizing principle of the resistance. His sons quarreled over succession. His commanders abandoned their positions. His state, which had been held together as much by his personal authority as by any institutional structure, dissolved in months. After Yaqub Beg's death, the resistance collapsed. Liu Jintang took Kashgar in December 1877 and Yarkand in January 1878. The reconquest was complete. What remained was the administrative phase, the reimposition of Qing governance over a territory that had been massively depopulated, economically devastated, and culturally transformed by 4 years of intensive warfare and a prior decade of rebellion and civil conflict. Zuo Zongtang submitted his final campaign memorial to the emperor. It was meticulous. It accounted for every regiment, every depot, every major engagement, every city taken. It expressed satisfaction at the achievement and gratitude to the emperor for the authority that had made it possible. It recommended specific officers for promotion and decoration. It addressed the question of future administration and the importance of Han settlement to ensure the long-term stability of the recovered territory. It was, in short, a perfect piece of imperial bureaucratic writing, precise and complete and entirely devoid of the smell of smoke. Consider what was left behind, and not in the abstract language of imperial archives, in the actual, physical, human reality of what existed in Xinjiang in 1878 that had not existed in 1864, and what existed in 1864 that did not exist in 1878. The demographic numbers are contested, as they always are for events of this kind, because the people who do the contesting have institutional interests in the numbers coming out one way or another, and because the original record-keeping was either destroyed or was never adequate to the full reality of what happened. But the available estimates suggest that the population of Xinjiang before the rebellions of the 1860s was somewhere between 4 and 5 million people. By the early 1880s, after the reconquest and the administrative reorganization that followed, the population was estimated at somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million. This is not a precise figure, but even at the most conservative interpretation, the population of Xinjiang had been reduced by more than half in the space of 2 decades. More than half. Take a moment with that number. Not as a statistic, but as a reality. More than half the people who had been alive in this place in 1860 were, 20 years later, either dead or gone. Every family reduced, every village depleted, every community of people who had lived and worked and worshipped and argued and raised children and buried their dead in this part of the world for generations. More than half of them gone. Dead or fled to Russian Central Asia, where some established communities that exist to this day and that are called, in the diaspora scholarship, the Taranchi communities, named for the specific Uyghur subgroup that was relocated east by the Qing in the 18th century and then fled west from the Qing in the 19th, or relocated by imperial order to agricultural colonies, or dead in the flight, because crossing the Tian Shan or the Pamir in winter with children and insufficient food and no guarantee of welcome on the other side was not a journey that everyone survived, or dead in the relocation because the conditions of imperial organized forced population transfer in the 19th century were not, to put it gently, designed with the welfare of the transferred population as a primary consideration. The oasis cities that had been among the most commercially active in Central Asia were in many cases depopulated ruins. Kashgar, which had been the western capital of Yaqub Beg's state and which before that had been a significant Silk Road trading center, was so depleted by the time Liu Jintang's forces took it that the new Qing administration faced the immediate practical problem of having insufficient population to staff the civilian economy. The agricultural systems that had supported those populations required generations to rebuild, and in some cases were rebuilt in forms that changed the relationship between the land and the people who worked it in ways that were not reversible. The Qing response to this demographic catastrophe was consistent with the imperial project that had produced it. The solution to depopulation was repopulation, specifically the settlement of Han Chinese migrants in the territories that had been emptied. This process, say which Zuo Zongtang had explicitly advocated for in his pre-campaign memorials, began almost immediately after the military phase ended. Soldiers who completed their service were encouraged to remain in Xinjiang as settlers, receiving land grants and agricultural assistance. Han farmers from the overcrowded provinces of the interior were offered incentives to relocate. Hui Muslims, the Chinese-speaking Muslim community that had cooperated with the Qing reconquest rather than joining the rebellion, were settled in specific regions as a buffer between the reconquered Uyghur population and the new Han settlers. Infrastructure was built to support Han settlement specifically, including agricultural colonies in regions that had been emptied by the campaigns. In 1884, Xinjiang was formally incorporated as a province of the Qing Empire. Given the same administrative structure as the interior Chinese provinces, a change that signaled the explicit rejection of any recognition of the territory's cultural distinctiveness. It was now, officially, just another province of China. The particularities of its population, their language, their religion, their history, their identity were to be administered within the same framework that administered Han Chinese identity. And the implicit logic of that framework was that these particularities were temporary complications on the road to full integration. This is what the aftermath of Zuo Zongtang's campaigns actually looked like. Not a military victory that restored order and allowed life to resume. A demographic and political transformation that changed what Xinjiang was permanently, and in ways that continue to generate consequences in the present tense. Now let us talk about how Zuo Zongtang is remembered, because the gap between his reputation in China and his reputation among the people his campaigns affected is one of the most instructive things about him, and about how empires remember their own architects. In China, he is celebrated. This is not a matter of fringe nationalism or recent political revisionism. He is celebrated in the mainstream of Chinese historical memory. In the textbooks used to educate children, in the monuments that stand in public spaces, in the popular culture that has processed his name into something familiar and even affectionate. There is a brand of braised beef noodle soup that bears his name, a dish supposedly associated with him or his soldiers during the campaigns. Whether the culinary story is accurate is largely irrelevant. What matters is that his name is attached to something comforting and domestic and ordinary. A bowl of noodles, which is a remarkable thing to do with the name of a man whose campaigns resulted in the deaths or displacement of millions of people. He is celebrated as one of the heroes of the Tongzhi Restoration, the period of reform and military rebuilding that followed the catastrophe of the Taiping years. He is credited with saving the dynasty's territorial integrity in the northwest, with demonstrating that Chinese governance could be effective in the face of foreign-backed separatism, with modernizing the military in ways that other commanders of his era failed to do. In the specific context of late Qing historiography, which was shaped by a dynasty trying to understand why it had been weakened and how it might be strengthened, he represented a model of capability and resolution that the era desperately wanted to believe was possible. He was celebrated not merely for what he did, but for what his success implied about what was still achievable. These things are true. The campaign was a genuine achievement of military logistics and strategic planning, evaluated entirely on its own terms, and bracketing the question of what the terms cost. He was a capable commander. He solved a genuine strategic problem. The reconquest of Xinjiang did, in the short to medium term, stabilize the dynasty's northwestern frontier. These facts are real. They do not exist in isolation from the other facts that are also real. In Xinjiang, among the Uyghur people, and among scholars who have studied the period from the perspective of the region's own history, the picture is radically different. Zuo Zongtang is remembered not as a restorer, but as a destroyer. The campaigns he commanded are recalled as the proximate cause of a demographic collapse from which the region's indigenous population took generations to recover, and from which, In the view of many Uyghur historians and cultural advocates, full recovery has been permanently precluded because the demographic and political transformation set in motion by the reconquest was never reversed. It was, instead, continued and accelerated by successive governments, each of which inherited the structural conditions that Zuo's campaigns had created, and each of which made choices within those conditions, saying that compounded rather than reversed the transformation. The temples and mosques that were destroyed during the campaigns were not rebuilt on the same scale. The libraries and schools that served the Uyghur literary and scholarly tradition were not restored. The underground water systems were rebuilt, but under Qing and subsequently Chinese state management, in forms that changed the relationship between the land and the people who worked it. The political structures that had given Uyghur communities some degree of self-governance, however limited and compromised by Qing overlordship, were replaced by the provincial administrative apparatus that Beijing controlled directly. The generation that survived Zuo Zongtang's campaigns was a generation defined by loss. They rebuilt, as people always do, because the alternative is not rebuilding, and there is a human stubbornness that insists on continuity, even when continuity requires constructing it from rubble. They rebuilt their mosques in smaller forms. They rebuilt their markets in emptier spaces. They raised children in villages that had been full before the campaigns and were half-empty afterward, in houses adjacent to the ruins of houses that had belonged to neighbors who were gone. They carried the memory of what had been lost, and they transmitted it, because memory of loss is one of the things that survives when everything else has been taken. The generation that followed was raised in a Xinjiang that was being administratively transformed around them. The provincial incorporation of 1884 was not merely a change of administrative designation. It was a signal, clear to anyone paying attention, saying that the Qing intended the transformation to be permanent, and that the institutions of Uyghur cultural and political life that had survived the campaigns would continue to face pressure. The schools that taught in the Uyghur language, the courts that applied Islamic law, the community structures through which the Uyghur social world was organized, all of these were now operating in the shadow of a state apparatus that viewed them as residual complications rather than legitimate expressions of a living culture. There is a line that runs, direct and unbroken, from Zuo Zongtang's campaigns in the 1870s to the situation in Xinjiang today. This is not a metaphorical line. It is an actual historical chain of causation and policy, and demographic change and cultural suppression and political tension that has accumulated and intensified across 6 generations. The Qing province became a Chinese nationalist-administered territory after the dynasty fell in 1912. It became a Chinese Communist Party-administered territory after 1949. The Han settlement policies that Zuo advocated were continued, accelerated, and institutionalized under each successive administration. The proportion of Han Chinese in the Xinjiang population, which had been negligible before the reconquest, grew steadily across the 20th century to the point where Han Chinese now constitute a substantial and economically dominant segment of the total population, concentrated in the cities and in the most economically valuable regions. Now, the scale of what has happened in Xinjiang in the 21st century, under the current administration, is a matter of intense international debate and contested claims. What is not contested is that the Uyghur people are experiencing, in the present tense, levels of surveillance, restriction, and coerced cultural change that are unprecedented even within the long history of the territory's incorporation into successive Chinese states. The infrastructure of control that currently exists in Xinjiang, the surveillance networks, the detention facilities, the restrictions on religious practice, the educational programs aimed at linguistic and cultural assimilation, is the most technologically advanced version of something that has been under construction in one form or another since 1878. Zuo Zongtang did not build what exists today, but he built the foundation, and he built it with the specific intention that whatever was built on it would be permanent. The policies of cultural and linguistic assimilation that were tentative under the Qing became systematic and then coercive under various subsequent governments. The Uyghur language has been progressively restricted in educational and official contexts. Religious practice has been subject to increasing state oversight. The political and cultural autonomy that was formally promised in the constitutional arrangements of the People's Republic has not been delivered in practice. The Uyghur people did not disappear. They survived. They retained their language, their religion, their cultural practices, their identity, in the face of sustained pressure designed at various points and to various degrees to eliminate or transform all of these things. The survival is remarkable. It is a testimony to the depth of the cultural roots that Zuo Zongtang's campaigns damaged but did not destroy. But the survival has come at enormous cost, and it has been, and continues to be, perpetually contested. What does it tell us about human nature, this story? The question always comes at the end of stories like this, and there is always the temptation to offer a tidy answer, to extract a lesson, to make the suffering legible as a source of wisdom that the living can use. Resist that temptation. The people who died in the Turpan Basin in 1876 did not die to teach us lessons. They died because a man at a writing table issued orders, and because those orders traveled down a chain of command that translated them into tortures and displacement and famine, and because the man at the writing table had been made, by his education and his experience and his ambition and his era and his civilization, into someone who could draft those orders without his hand trembling. But if there is something to say about human nature, it is this. The capacity for moral abstraction that made Zuo Zongtang possible is not unique to him or to the Qing or to the 19th century. It is a general human capacity. It is the capacity to create, between ourselves and the consequences of our decisions, a sufficient layer of institutional language and bureaucratic process, an ideological framing that the consequences become invisible, or become acceptable, or become someone else's responsibility. And every large institution that has ever engaged in mass violence has depended on this capacity. It is not pathological. It is not the province of monsters. It is the normal operation of minds that are good at building systems and bad at looking honestly at what the systems do to people. The second thing to say is this. The official record is a weapon, not a neutral depository of information, not an objective chronicle, but a weapon in the hands of those who create it, used to define what happened and what it means, and who counts as a victim, and who counts as an obstacle to be cleared. Zuo Zongtang's memorials are preserved in the imperial archives, studied in universities, quoted in textbooks. Miranisa's testimony exists in fragments, preserved by her descendants against the pressure of a history that had no structural interest in preserving it. The archive keeps the general's words because the general served the state, and the state keeps records of what its servants did and why. The people on the other side of the general's decisions are not in the archive, because the archive was not built for them. This is not unique to China or to the Qing. This is how archives work everywhere. The archive is the administrative instrument of the powerful, and it records what the powerful decided to record, and it omits what the powerful found inconvenient or simply did not think to ask about. The history that reaches us through archives is therefore systematically skewed toward the perspective of the powerful, and correcting for that skew requires the kind of deliberate a sustained effort that Mihrenissa's descendants made across generations, and that the historians who collected those fragments made across careers. Zuo Zongtang was a man of extraordinary ability and profound moral blindness, and the combination was more dangerous than either quality alone. He could see everything except the most important thing. He could calculate everything except the value of the people he was calculating with. He could write beautiful letters to his son about the obligation of a man of learning to serve the civilization that had formed him, and he could simultaneously direct a military campaign that was at that moment transforming the civilizations of other people's children into rubble. These were not separate minds operating in isolated compartments. This was one mind, organized around a framework that assigned moral weight to some categories of human beings and not to others. And the framework was not his invention. He inherited it from his civilization, his education, his era, the entire institutional apparatus of the imperial Confucian world, with its hierarchies and its categories and its centuries of accumulated ideology about who counted and who did not. He applied it with exceptional competence. He extended it to its logical conclusion. But the framework existed before him, and it outlasted him, and in its outlines, in the fundamental assumption that some people's claims to land and culture and self-determination are legitimate and others are obstacles to be managed in the service of someone else's civilizational project. It is still recognizable in the world today, dressed in different language, but performing the same operation. He died in 1885. He was 73 years old, which was a long life by the standards of his era, and a longer one than most of the people his campaigns had killed or displaced. He died in Fuzhou, far from Xinjiang, having returned east to take command of operations during the Sino-French War, which was the dynasty's next military crisis after the Northwest. He died honored. He died a Grand Secretary of the Empire, a holder of decorations too numerous to list, the man who had saved the Northwest and whose name would be attached to a bowl of noodles and a chapter in every textbook about the heroic restoration of the Qing's territorial integrity. He died, as far as anyone can tell, at peace with his own record. He did not write, in his final years, about Turpan. So he did not write about Kashgar. He wrote about his health, which was poor. He wrote about his family. He wrote, in the correspondence of his last months, about the importance of maintaining the values of the Confucian tradition in an era of foreign pressure and internal uncertainty. He was concerned, in the last years of his life, with the moral integrity of the civilization he had served. He was concerned about whether the dynasty would find men of sufficient quality and conviction to face the challenges ahead. He was not concerned about Mihrenissa. He did not know she existed. That is the final thing to say. Not that he was a monster who knew what he had done and did not care, but that he was a man of genuine moral seriousness who had organized his moral seriousness around a set of categories that excluded, by construction, the people who most needed inclusion in his moral accounting. He was concerned with civilization, with loyalty, with the proper conduct of a man in relation to his obligations. He was not concerned with the Uyghur woman running into the desert, because in the framework that had formed him and that he had spent 60 years deepening and refining, she was not the kind of being whose fate generated obligations. This is the engine of empire. Not hatred, not the desire to destroy, the ability to simply not see, the ability to look at a landscape of ruin and read it as restoration, the ability to look at a depopulated territory and read it as pacification, the ability to organize an enormous and effective machine of violence and to look at the reports it generates and see only strategy, only results, only the satisfaction of objectives achieved. In the autumn of 1877, as his armies were closing in on Kashgar and the end of the campaign was in sight, Zuo Zongtang wrote a letter to one of his sons. He wrote about the importance of sustained study through difficulty. He wrote about the relationship between discipline and character, about the Confucian understanding of self-cultivation as the foundation of public service. He wrote, with evident tenderness, about his concern for his son's health and well-being. It is a genuinely beautiful letter, the letter of a man who cared about the human beings in his immediate circle with real and sincere depth. He did not write about Kashgar. He did not write about what was happening at that moment in the territory his armies were taking. He wrote about his son's education. Think about that. Not as a condemnation, as an observation, as a window into the mechanism. This is how it works. This is the structure of the thing. The love and the violence do not cancel each other out. They coexist in the same mind, organized around a framework that determines who is real and who is not, who counts and who does not, whose suffering registers and whose does not. The love is real. The violence is real. The framework that makes both possible simultaneously, without contradiction, without trembling, is what we should be looking at. Mihranisa ran into the desert. She survived at enormous cost and lived another decade and died at 42, and her descendants carried her name and her story forward through generations of displacement and pressure and the sustained effort of a people trying to remain themselves against the force of a state that preferred them otherwise. The story survived because someone decided it mattered, because a descendant decided that the name of a woman who ran into a desert in 1876 with 3 children and no certainty of survival was worth preserving against the indifference of the official record. Because memory is itself a form of resistance, and because the people whose memories have been most systematically suppressed are also, often, the ones who most fiercely preserve them. The official record does not mention her. The official record mentions Zuo Zongtang on nearly every page of the relevant section, his strategy, his memorials, of his promotions, his honors, his assessment of the campaign's success. The official record is thorough and detailed and well-preserved and, within its own terms, accurate. It is also the record of one side of what happened, and the one side whose account has reached the textbooks and the monuments and the bowl of noodles bearing his name. The official record is not the whole record. We opened it. We are closing it now. But not before saying clearly what it contained and what it omitted, and why the omission is itself the most important thing to understand. Because the gap between the general's memorial and the woman's testimony is not merely a historical curiosity. It is the shape of how power works. It is the shape of how empires maintain themselves, not just through military force, which is expensive and unreliable, but through the control of the account, through the insistence that the account that matters is the account of the people who built the machine, not the account of the people the machine was built to process. The smoke over Turpan rose in 1876 and drifted west, toward the mountains, toward nothing in particular. Somewhere in the desert beyond the burning village, 3 children walked behind their mother, the oldest carrying the youngest when her arms tired, the middle one silent because he was 4 and did not have words for what he was watching. They walked toward distance. Distance was all there was. Remember that. Remember her name. Mihranisa. The archive forgot her. We do not have to.